All right, let's begin. This is APES, AP Chapter 5, Part 2 of our lecture. Now we're going to get into these nutrient cycles that we kind of started wrapping things up with. Nutrients, well, these are things that we need for growth, for respiration, for building tissue. All living organisms need different nutrients and different amounts of nutrients. Right? So this is the section where we discuss these nutrients and how they cycle through our environment. Reservoirs are areas that store varying amounts of nutrients. Nutrients reside there, all right? Sometimes we may call reservoirs sinks. And a sink, by definition, is an area that accepts more nutrients than they release. Let me give you an example of what a sink would be. Forests, okay? Forests generally accept more nutrients like carbon than they release, but if we set a forest on fire, it is no longer a sink. It is now releasing carbon and not absorbing it. It becomes a source. So a forest as is a sink or a reservoir of carbon. If you set this forest on fire, you are now releasing more carbon than it is accepting. It becomes a source. All right. Sources include like power plants. They're burning fossil fuels. A source could be decomposition of organic matter, could lead to carbon dioxide being released. That could be a source of carbon. All right. So sources are generally releasing the nutrients. Okay. Sinks are generally accepting more of them. Sinks are also referred to as reservoirs or reservoirs, excuse me. All right. Pools falls in there sometimes, but beware of the word pool. All right. So sources are releasing, sinks are accepting. Reservoirs are sometimes called sinks. All right. The ocean stores carbon. Okay. Forests store carbon. The atmosphere stores carbon. Okay. And they store it in different forms. If you set that forest on fire, it now becomes a source, basically. It's now releasing carbon to the atmosphere. Water cycle, also called the hydrologic cycle. We're not going to cover it in a lot of detail. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it because we will cover it in a lot more detail in a chapter specifically about water. What you need to know is that the ocean is the biggest reservoir, and 97% of the water on our planet is saltwater. Okay, 3% is only 3% of the water on our planet is fresh, and that's a big deal because we need fresh water for our survival. The cycle is very simple. Okay, simple. Evaporation or transpiration pulls water from the earth or from a plant. It goes up, it condenses and forms clouds. Condensing means you're going from a gas to a liquid, and then it falls as precipitation. It's a cycle of events. Okay. And by the way, most of the fresh water on our planet, it's not even in the water form. It's actually frozen in glaciers. Okay. So evaporation, simple term. Water leaves surface and enters the air. Okay, it goes from a liquid to a gas. Transpiration is liquid to a gas, but specifically from the leaves of plants is how water leaves the plants. Condensation, going from from a gas to a liquid. This happens on the outside of your soda can when you leave it sitting out a cold drink. And precipitation is how it falls to the earth as water or rain or snow, so on and so forth. Groundwater, we will spend a lot more time discussing groundwater in another chapter, so I'm going to be real brief on groundwater. This is water that percolates through the soil and makes its way into the ground. The upper limit we would call the water table. Areas of rock that hold it, we call aquifers. Right? How do we get groundwater out? Well, we can dig a well. Eventually, it may merge with the spring and makes its way to surface waters also. Okay. How do we affect the water cycle? Well, like I said, we have a whole chapter on water coming up. We're going to talk about it more there, but the biggest effects of it are damming of rivers. We change the way water flows, and this has a lot of impacts. We'll cover that again. Removing vegetation means more water gets run off rather than making its way through the plants and through the ground and into the groundwater. Okay, so we remove vegetation, and it just flows right off and causes massive erosion. Keeps moving, basically. We withdraw groundwater at a very rapid rate. We'll talk about this later. That leads to sinkholes. And air pollution is also a big factor. We put pollutants that end up falling to the earth when it rains. All right. Now let's get into the carbon cycle. This is a big deal in environmental science. You need to really have a deep understanding of the carbon cycle. Why is it such a big deal? Because of this. CO2 in the air is getting, the levels are getting too high. And CO2 in the air is probably the biggest factor impacting climate change currently. So you need to have a big, major understanding of the cycle, what can benefit the cycle, what hurts the cycle, and so on and so forth. First off, you need to understand photosynthesis and respiration. This one, photosynthesis, it removes CO2. Carbon dioxide in the air is inorganic. Okay, it's inorganic. Glucose, those are organic. But CO2 is not organic. So photosynthesis takes inorganic carbon in the air and turns it into organic carbon, food, for example. Right? Cellular respiration. All right, so organisms that do cellular respirations would be what we would call a carbon source. They are releasing more carbon than they are accepting. So how do they release the carbon? Well, they take in the tissue or the organic molecules that make up the organism. They consume them. We do this when we do cellular respiration, and decomposers do this too. You consume organic molecules, you make energy. That's what respiration is all about. And carbon is released, but it's not just released as carbon, it's released as CO2. So these two processes together balance each other out. Photosynthesis makes glucose and oxygen. Respiration makes water and carbon dioxide. Not a lot of water, very little water. This is uptaken by the organism. This is not a major part of the water cycle. This is more uptaken by the organism, but they're related to each other. The carbon dioxide gets taken in, oxygen comes out, we take in oxygen, we make carbon dioxide. But really, where does this carbon come from? It comes from the glucose. Food becomes carbon dioxide. That's the two sources that are connected right there. So remove CO2, adds CO2 to the air. We already mentioned this, decomposition. It returns carbon back to the air, basically, to the atmosphere, because that is cellular respiration. Sediments basically settle in the bottom of the ocean. All right, well, check this out. This is how fossil fuels form. We call them fossil fuels, and people assume it was a dinosaur, but it was a fossil fuel. The fossil was probably plant. Okay, so more often than not, it's plant or phytoplankton, sinks to the bottom. It gets buried in the sediments for long periods of time. It becomes an anaerobic environment, a lot of heat and pressure, and eventually fossil fuels form. Carbon gets turned into coal. It gets turned into natural gas, methane gas. It can get turned into petroleum or oil. Those are the different fossil fuels. The largest reservoir of carbon is sedimentary rock. Right? So within this rock structures, you have coal. That would be, and within sedimentary rock is coal, and that is the carbon source. That is a reservoir. It's not a source, excuse me. It's a reservoir. All right. So another reservoir, another area that stores carbon, sedimentary rock. Fossil fuels are storing it within rock structures. Forests are also holding on to carbon. The ocean holds on to carbon. How does the ocean hold on to carbon? It generally dissolves it, but it doesn't turn it into carbon dioxide. It turns it into bicarbonate ions, and then these are incorporated. These carbonates and bicarbonates are incorporated in the shells of marine organisms. Excess CO2, as the oceans are absorbing a lot of carbon dioxide and it's not turning into bicarbonate because there's so much there already, this carbon dioxide carbonates the water and makes it more acidic. It can. So that's one of the problems of climate change too. Not just climate change, this extra CO2 is making the oceans a little bit more acidic, basically. Okay. So, but most of the carbon in the ocean is stored as bicarbonate. And now the oceans are getting more acidic as a result of some of this carbon dioxide that's building up too. So here's what's happening. Why are fossil fuels so bad? We are taking carbon that was stored, okay? Carbon that was stored in the lithosphere, the rocky portion of our Earth. It could have been coal, it could have been stored in between rocks in the form of oil or petroleum or natural gas. So we're taking carbon and removing it from the litho and putting it into the atmosphere at a rate that is just way too high. This number here, it's over this now. This is an average over 400 parts per million 400 parts per million is a terrible number. When I started teaching this class, we were in about 370 or 360 parts per million was our average. The whole goal, the planet's goal, literally all the environmentalists on the planet were talking about, please, we can't get to 400 parts per million. And now we're averaging over 400 parts per million. So that was the magic number we did not want to exceed. And now we're exceeding it and we're staying there. What is the biggest factor that's causing this increase in CO2 is burning of fossil fuels. Any burning reaction is called a combustion. And combustion, really, one of the main things that's released is carbon dioxide. So anytime you burn or combust, you release carbon dioxide. We burn a lot of fossil fuels to create electricity, and we use them as fuel on our planet. Okay? Deforestation. Less photosynthesis means more CO2 in the air, basically. All right? And I already mentioned to you, CO2 that is being absorbed and not turning into bicarbonate ions is making our oceans more acidic and decreasing pH. And this carbon cycle is the driving force behind climate change. Now we're going to talk about the nitrogen cycle. This cycle is a little bit more in depth. There's a little bit more parts to it, so beware of this one on the test. Why is nitrogen needed? Why is it important? Well, our genetic instructions require it. Proteins require it. Proteins include enzymes which help control how things work. So we need nitrogen, plants need nitrogen, especially for these things, to make these organic molecules. Most of the air, almost 80, 78% of the air is nitrogen. It's nitrogen gas, N2. All right. So the air is a nitrogen sink. All right. It stores nitrogen. All right. Nitrogen fixation. Now, this is a process by which nitrogen is taken from the air by bacteria, okay? And the bacteria are in the soil, and they can take nitrogen that's floating around in their air, and they can fix it, okay? What does that mean? Well, they turn it into something that's more usable by the plant. So it starts out as nitrogen gas, which is inert. It's non-reactive. They turn this into ammonia, and then ammonia dissolves in water and turns into ammonium. So for the most part, what you need to know is they're basically the same thing. Ammonia by itself is NH3, dissolve ammonia in water, and you get ammonia. Okay? So nitrogen fixation, certain bacteria, they have a mutualistic relationship with the roots of plants, with plants. All right? What do the plants give them? Food, sugar. They do photosynthesis. So they get food. These bacteria, these nitrogen-fixing bacteria, what they do on the nodules they form nodules on the root plants, and what they do is they absorb nitrogen gas in the air, and they fix it and turn it into ammonium. And ammonium is one of the usable forms of nitrogen for a plant. Okay, commonly found in legumes such as soybeans, but there are other plant species that definitely utilize this. So bacteria take inert or unreactive nitrogen out of the air. They take this non-reactive nitrogen in the air that doesn't really do a whole lot for the plant. Even though the plant needs nitrogen, they can't use this. It turns it into ammonia, which becomes ammonium, and now the plant has a usable form. Okay, most plants, ammonium is not the usable form. Okay, but it can be used by some plants. Next step, decomposers. All right, there are bacteria involved in a lot of the steps. All right, decomposers break down dead or living tissue. All right, and they break it down and they turn it into ammonium. Okay, ammonium, now we have an ammonium source. So when things die, their tissue becomes ammonium. Well, ammonium is it's a common decomposition product from a protein. When proteins get broken down, ammonium is commonly produced. When proteins are made by plants, they use ammonium to make proteins. All right, so ammonification, it's when bacteria convert organic stuff, amino acids, organic nitrogen would be the proteins or the building blocks of proteins, and they turn them into ammonia. Okay? Nitrification, that comes next. All right? That's where bacteria can turn ammonium eventually into nitrate. It goes from ammonium to nitrite and nitrite to nitrate. More plants on the planet, this is the most usable form of nitrogen for plants. So the two usable forms are nitrate and ammonium, but most plants utilize nitrate, which is why this nitrification step takes place. Okay. Plants directly uptake the nitrate. Okay, so it's not the only usable, but it's the main usable form for plants. If you get this on an AP test, what is the main usable form? It's nitrate. If they want to know all usable forms, it's ammonium and nitrate, but mainly nitrate. All right. So what do? We add ammonium, we add nitrates to fertilizer, basically, and it ends up. That's what fertilizers are made out of. How do we get our nitrogen? What we eat, and we get it in our proteins. Okay. And finally, denitrification. This is a negative step for plants. This is where certain soil bacteria can take those usable nitrates and convert them back into nitrogen gas that enters the air. So it kind of removes the usable form for the soil. So denitrifying bacteria would not be good for plants. The Haber-Bosch process, this is the process that humans figured out on how to basically produce or synthesize ammonia for fertilizer. Okay, so it's just a process. You need to know the term, and why is it important? Well, that's because we are doing this process a lot. And why are we doing this process a lot? Because we grow so much food on our planet for all the people that live here. So all the food that we grow needs fertilizer. All those plants need fertilizer, and so we have to produce it using the Haber-Bosch process. So this is the synthetic or man-made production of fertilizers. All right, let's do the phosphorus cycle. All right, phosphorus cycle. It's not as detailed as nitrogen cycle. Not as detailed as the nitrogen cycle. Here's the phosphorus cycle. All right, same thing. Decomposition is involved. Something dies and it decomposes, and its parts become phosphates. All right, so that's one way. That's similar. That this decomposition step also happens in the nitrogen cycle. How do organisms, consumers like you and me, how do we take in our phosphorus? We eat. We consume. All right. How do plants get it? Well, they get it from their soil. They take it up in their soil. Where does phosphorus come from? Well, a lot of it is in rocks that weather and break down. So phosphorus is in a lot of rock material. So the soil has phosphorus in it naturally. Plants take it in. That gets eaten by the organism. The organism dies or decomposes, and it makes its way back into the soil. All right. Very little phosphorus in the air. Not a lot. Very little. So it's not an important part of the atmosphere. The atmospheric phosphorus is in such small quantities that it's not involved in this phosphorus cycle. Why do we need phosphorus? DNA and RNA, similar to the nitrogen cycle, and also energy, or ATP. That P stands for phosphate or phosphorus. And I already mentioned to you, weathering is a fancy word for breaking down rocks. Erosion means carrying them away somewhere, but weathering is breaking them down. So rocks get broken down, phosphate enters the water supply. Okay, so it enters the water, enters the land. That's how phosphorus mainly enters a system. Okay, aquatic organisms, they take in the phosphate right from their water, from their environment. You and me, a plant takes it through their roots. You and me, we need to eat it and consume it in our diets. And how does phosphorus make its way back? One way it makes its way back, living things decompose. All right, and just like nitrogen compounds, nitrates and phosphates can do major damage. They lead to eutrophication. And phosphates are found in detergents and wastewater. All right. So our laundry detergents, you may notice some of them might say phosphate free. Well, that is detergent that is better for the environment because it is not going to cause eutrophication when it ends up in a body of water. So phosphate free detergents are better for the environment because they don't cause eutrophication specifically. All right. And just right here, this goes back to Chesapeake Bay from the central case. What can we do to help fix things? Well, reducing the amount of fertilizer that's used would be a good one. We overuse fertilizer in our farm country. They don't use just enough fertilizer. They use way more than they need because they don't want it to be limiting to the growth of their plants, and they want to have the biggest yield, their biggest harvest. We can plant buffers near areas that can absorb some of this runoff before it causes eutrophication. We can get better at treating sewage because sewage has a lot of sewage. You know, what happens with sewage, it decomposes in a sewage tank somewhere, and that decomposition releases the phosphates and the nitrates. So sewage is not a good thing. Areas where you have farming, where you're, for example, like an area where you might have a pig farm, or even cows. Well, their fecal matter is sewage, and it starts to decompose and break down, and it can cause problems with nutrient over-enrichment when it starts breaking down. Also, finally, if we use less fossil fuels in general, we would do better things for the earth. We'd create less CO2. That'll end our lecture.